Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on using dynamic authorization for the Apigee API gateway.
I'm going to start off with a little bit of a short introduction to ABAC, attribute-based access control in general, but the webinar is not specifically to cover that topic in depth. We're here to talk about how we can apply attribute-based access control to authorization for APIs, and more specifically, how we can handle the concept of redacting and filtering information that an API gateway, and in my case, Apigee, can be done. So first off, on ABAC, this is the concept of leveraging attributes and attribute data coupled with a policy to handle authorization. And with this, we get context-aware dynamic authorization, where we can leverage attributes, where attributes can be anything. We move away from the traditional sort of role-based access control architecture methodology. So in this case, an attribute can be pretty much anything. So we can cover all of the things that we see here, sort of who is trying to get access, what are they trying to get access to, when, where, why, and how. And all of these things combined, all of the data, the attribute data, combined with an access policy will yield an authorization, almost like an authorization entitlement at runtime. So there's several different building blocks for the authorization here, and we'll look at some of these aspects in more detail as we go along here. Some of the characteristics when we talk about ABAC, and we'll hear different terminologies for this out there in the market: externalized access control, centralized access control, dynamic access control, but all of these characteristics apply to ABAC. So it becomes externalized in the sense that we can externalize the access control from the business logic and from applications. And what we're looking at here today is we're actually going to externalize the authorization logic from the API gateway itself. It becomes centralized in the sense that typically you have a centralized authorization engine that caters for the authorization requests. This is the authorization engine that holds the policy and receives an authorization request that it can then later respond to. The authorization engine can handle authorization for several different applications. It can cater authorization queries or requests from the API gateway, but also from other applications, for example. In our case, it's standardized. We build on top of the XACML or XACML standard. It's an OASIS standard. So policies are standardized, and the architecture is standardized too. We'll see probably several different abbreviations, and you'll get familiar with those if you're not already, but that is also defined by the XACML standard. It's flexible, where we can apply authorization to many different types of use cases. We'll look at APIs here. I'll actually mention databases, but there are other cases as well where you can handle authorization for homegrown applications or off-the-shelf applications, different types of use cases, whether it's, you know, approving transactions, viewing medical records, or even controlling access to physical access to, for example, a room or something like that, a building. It's dynamic, where we, like I mentioned earlier, calculate the entitlement based on the attribute combined with the policy at runtime. So the dynamic aspect here is attributes change, and at runtime you can get different decisions obviously then if an attribute has changed. So if a user has a given or is assigned to a given cost center, but that gets changed in the HR system, you'll probably get a different decision if that's basis for the authorization. But you get that without changing the application, without changing the policy. What actually change is what cost center a user is assigned to, and that's something that changes regardless in the HR system, for example. It is context-based and risk-based in the sense that we can leverage things like that as input. Essentially, they're also just attributes, but as input to make an authorization decision. This is a big slide. What we're focusing on in the conversation today is API gateways and specifically Apigee. We've done integration with a number of market-leading API gateways in the market. We have, I think, most of what we worked with in this slide here. And although the concept is the same for all of them, it's slightly different in the way we in the way the integration has to happen. Some API gateways has capabilities to handle what we want to do out of the box. Some requires a little bit of coding. It's usually not that complicated to achieve anyways. But the bottom line is that the principle is the same. The API gateway will essentially intercept the call, and we have to call an authorization engine to authorize that. We are going to specifically look at Apigee today. Part of that decision for this webinar is that it's probably one of the most common API gateways that we come across at Axiomatics from an integration perspective and what our customers use. It does have an out-of-the-box integration in the sense that it requires only a configuration on the Apigee gateway. We don't have to write any custom connector or custom policy that gets implemented on the Apigee side or on the gateway side. For the redaction of data, which we'll look at in detail later, there is a little bit of code that needs to be written. We leverage JavaScript within Apigee to do this. It's essentially a way of modifying the backend API payload that you're requesting and redacting that based on the policy. And we'll go into detail on that. But to integrate the two, Apigee and Axiomatics, there's no specific code that needs to be done in order for Apigee to call Axiomatics. So if we look at that specifically, there's typically two aspects to API authorization that we talk about. One is the authorization on the way in, and the other one is authorization on the way out. And what we mean by that is on the way in is sort of an authorization of the API call in itself. And what we do here is that there's a call to the API. The API gateway is intercepting that. And in our world and in terminologies that we use, the API gateway becomes what's called a policy enforcement point. It is responsible to intercept the call and enforce the decision. So what happens here is that we configure the gateway to make a call out, which is number 2 in this diagram here, to the Axiomatics policy server, or more specifically, the authorization engine. And the authorization engine then holds a policy in place, so it's going to evaluate the incoming request against a policy. It will optionally, if need be, look up additional attributes from underlying data sources. Here, LDAP and SQL are exemplified, but it could be any data source that holds the information, the attribute information that you need. The authorization engine will then come to a decision. based on the attributes and the policy. And in number 5 here, we get a yes, or more technically, a permit decision that gets sent back to the API gateway. And the gateway then acts on that decision. If it's deny, it would probably stop right there and return an access denied or something like that response back to the caller. But in this case, it's permit, so the flow can continue. And if we only do this authorization, then the API gateway would forward the API call in number 6 here to the backend API or backend source and get a response in 7 and return it to the caller in 8. But this is sort of the on the way in architecture of this. If we want to look at the response here from the backend API in number 7 and do something with that before it gets returned as number 8 in this architecture back to the caller, i.e. filtering or masking the payload that's being returned here, then we have the on the way out scenario that I mentioned earlier. So let's take a deeper look at that. There are a couple of different options of technically how to achieve that. There's something in the, or there's a couple of things in the XACML standard that can handle this or help with this. The first thing we'll look at is obligations. There's something called obligations and advice. They work pretty much the same way, although advice does not have to be acted on by the enforcement point, whereas obligations you do. The second thing is the multi-decision profile request, also known as the MDP request. This is a way of sending multiple requests in one go. The third thing is not part of the XACML standard. It's something that Axiomatics have as a separate authorization endpoint on our authorization engine, which is called Axiomatics Reverse Query, or ARQ in short. This is the way of asking open-ended questions. So we'll look in detail to how we can leverage that for this type of scenario as well. The fourth thing that I just want to mention and we'll look at also is Axiomatics Data Access Filter, or ADAF. This is actually not performing filtering or redactions in the gateway. It would sit in between the gateway and the data source, provided that the data source is something that ADAF supports. So we'll take a look at that as well and how that can help in this case. From a sort of architectural flow perspective, what happens here is that we have the call. I've cut out some of the details of the previous architecture, but we have here is the caller in the middle of the funnel. We have the API gateway, and then the cogwheel here is the backend API. And so what we want to do is we want to get a decision from a policy decision engine, or from an authorization engine about what to redact. So the backend API holds a record. In this case, it's record 1, 2, 3, and it has data to it. We have an authorization decision that the field's owner and status should be redacted. And so what gets returned back to the caller is a redacted owner and status field. We've essentially removed the information from those two. Now, there are obviously different ways of doing it. This is essentially just clearing out the information, but you could also do some kind of masking where if one of the fields were to be a social security number or credit card number or something like that, where you can then write a function that masks it appropriately and only shows the last 4 or something like that. So the function of how to redact is something that we can control and actually author or write code for on our own. Whereas what to redact or mask is a decision based on a policy. So there's separation there in terms of First, there's a policy with attributes that decides what to redact and under what circumstance, and then how to do it is something that we can control. In my example, I'm essentially just replacing the string in the original payload with an empty string, but that could be made into a more advanced function. So if you look at how to handle this with obligations, first of all, obligations is added or was added into the XACML 3.0 version of the standard, which is something that Axiomatics fully support. Also, Axiomatics has been heavily involved in driving that standard. We can return obligations either on a permit or on a deny decision from the authorization engine. So you could technically say that if you get a permit decision to view record 1, 2, 3, we are going to, with that permit decision, return a set of obligations that define what to redact, what fields to redact based on that permit decision. There are more usages for obligations. You can send information back to the enforcement point. That is essentially the functionality of obligations. So you're not constrained to only leveraging this for what I'm looking at doing here, returning some metadata, we can call it, around what information that should be redacted. Other use cases for obligations could, for example, be step-up authentication, where you're trying to access a resource, but you need to be multi-factor authenticated to access that specific resource. You can then get a permit with a sort of an obligation that says you have to perform step-up authentication before you can access this resource. Other scenarios could be break the glass, reason for permit or deny. A reason for deny could be useful to be able to handle by the caller in the sense that you can act on it a little bit more. You can say deny because you don't belong to the correct department, or you don't have enough clearance, or your approval limit is not high enough, or something like that. You can also use obligations, probably not obligations, but more advice for logging purposes, where you can return additional data from the authorization engine that can then be logged on the application side, the policy enforcement point side. And then the last one, example of usage, is the what we're looking at here. Information about what fields to redact on a permit decision. Sorry for the verboseness of this slide here, but I wanted to show what an obligation looks like in the response from an authorization engine. So this is an example of it, and what we can see here is that we have an obligation in the response. This is a JSON formatted response. We can see that the ID, there's an ID added in here that's called axiomatics.demo.fields, and that contains, in this case here, two attribute definitions, or two attributes. It's actually the same attribute, but it contains different values. So you can see that an attribute called mask_fields has the value owner, and then the same attribute has the value status. So this ends up being a list of values within the mask_fields attribute, and this comes back to the policy enforcement point that called the PDP. This is what is a part of the obligation that notes what are the fields that the API gateway should mask. And there's more information in the response, so this is just kind of a snippet that shows the specific obligation from it. If we look at the steps that needs to happen from a perspective of redacting or masking the payload, is that first you want to check if there is an obligation. So we're skipping a couple of sort of steps that we've covered already. So we do have a configuration in Apigee that calls the authorization engine. You get a decision back. So the first thing is to check, are there any obligations? If there aren't, then you're not going to mask or redact anything. Then we need to parse the obligations to determine what fields to redact. So that's parsing the previous payload that I just showed. After that, we know what fields that we need to redact. So we need some code that can do the redaction or masking of those specific fields. And like I said in my demo that I'll show later, I will simply just replace the value string with an empty string. And after we've done that, we need to rewrite the payload. So we're rewriting the actual return payload that gets returned to the caller, and then returning the modified payload. So we have, or I have a simple sample JavaScript that can handle this in Apigee. It would probably be applicable and with slight modifications to apply that to other gateways as well, especially other gateways that would support JavaScript. But other gateways that don't necessarily support JavaScript, you can still leverage the flow of what happens in the JavaScript to understand and to determine what needs to be done, you know, in the programming language that's supported by the gateway. If we move to the next technology that can be used for the redaction and masking would be the multi-decision profile request. In this case, we're not going to leverage obligations at all. We are going to have to leverage a different kind of policy. So you would here, in this case, have to have a policy for that describes, or a policy that has awareness of the fields in the payload. So in my case, I have the resources I'm dealing with are records, and they have ID, department, owner, and status. And so I can have, well, I could have 4 policies on that. I could have a policy that controls access to the ID field. I could have essentially, to be more specific, I would have 4 different rules in my policy. One rule that controls access to the ID, a rule that controls access to department, owner, and status, and so forth. And what we can leverage the multi-decision profile request for is that we can ask several questions in one go to the authorization engine. So instead of sending one request that asks, can Alice view the field ID of record 123? And then you get a permit back, for example. And then you have to send another question asking, can Alice view the field department of record 123? And so forth and so forth. You can ask all of these 4 questions in one go. Can Alice view field ID and department and owner and status in record 123? And you will get multiple responses back. You might get a permit, deny, deny back, for example. So yeah, you can view ID and department, but you got denied for the owner and status field, for example. This the leveraging the multi-decision profile request, this is a profile of XACML. So this is essentially an extension of the core XACML specification. And what's powerful here is that you get a very clean and very easily understandable policy of what's happening. So you can express authorization on each and every field in the type of resource that you're dealing with. Now, there's ways to structure the policy in such a way that you don't have to, if you have large, many fields in the resource that you're dealing with, let's say that you have 100 fields, you don't necessarily have to specify a policy for each individual field within the policy. Only fields that you want to perform redaction on. So there are ways to handle that, even if there's a lot of different fields within the resources that we're dealing with. And here's one part, a snippet of a multi-decision profile request. In this request, we are adding an access subject attribute that's called employee ID, and we pass in Bob. We also add a record field of department, and we add an action ID of view. So in this case here, we're essentially asking, can Bob view the field department? And then there would be additional attributes in here defining sort of what record are we dealing with, because here we can only see record dot field. These dots right here would means that we could have additional attributes that we pass in as part of the request. So an additional piece that would be passed in could be another record field attribute where the value, instead of being department, is owner, for example. So this is just a snippet of a request. It's not a full request. And if we look at the response, you can see here that we get a permit decision back in this example here, and we denote that we actually see attributes coming back in the response, that you get a permit decision for the field department and for the action view. Now, this would continue. This is not a complete response because it can't fit in a PowerPoint, but an additional part of this response could be the same thing, that you get a permit decision for the field owner for the action view. And it can also include that the decision is denied for the field amount for the action view. So we have all the information to be able to determine which specific fields do I have a permit or deny access to based on the response. The next technology for handling this would be Axiomatics reverse query, which is a powerful authorization endpoint that is very, very good at listing an open-ended type of queries. It's extremely powerful and flexible, which also makes it a little bit more complex than some of the other technologies that we just looked at. It would require a little bit more integration work, and the specifics around that is that it requires a little bit more massaging of the response that you get back, and we'll see an example of the response from ARQ. But it's extremely powerful in the sense that we can ask any type of open-ended question, and in our case, we want to understand what fields that we can view within a specific record. So the open-ended question, remember that the previous technologies, we are asking yes or no question. Can Alice view field owner of record 1, 2, 3? Here we flip it and we can ask open-ended questions such as, what fields in record 1, 2, 3 can Alice view? And we would get a representation of what those fields are back in the response. We could theoretically tweak these queries to be anything else too. You could say, given record 1, 2, 3, and given the field owner, who can view it? And given the field owner in record 1, 2, 3, what action can Alice perform on it? Can she view it? Can she update it, for example? So you can flip these open-ended queries either way you want. In our case, it's sort of resource-centric in the sense that we're looking at what fields that Alice can view. Now, we're going to get another fairly verbose slide here. This is an ARQ response, and it's a snippet of it. It's one of the pieces within an ARQ response. And here, what we're doing is we're applying a sort of a string equal function. So it basically says that this first attribute here, record department, and the second attribute, user department, has to be string equal. Essentially what we're saying is that record department has to be equal to user department, and this is not spelled correctly even, but record department and user department has to be equal in order to get a permit decision. So it's one piece of the ARQ response. This, just like the other ones, can't fit on the PowerPoint slide, so it's a snippet of a full response. If we kind of simplify what a response could look like, it is something like this. In order to get access to a record and a record field specifically, we could say that, or the response could be that the record department and the user department has to be equal. Sorry. And the user role and the user role has to be client, and the record field has to be department. This gives a permit decision. So from an open-ended perspective, this is what a user has access to. So this could be one of the constraints sort of in the ARQ response. There could also be a second entry like this in the response that says, if the record department and the user department is equal, the role is equal client, and the field is equal to owner, then you also have access, for example. So this is information that comes back from those open-ended type of queries. The bonus in how we can handle filtration and masking would be using Axiomatics data access filter. And the reason I'm saying bonus is that this is not something that happens inside of the gateway. It's actually handled completely outside of the gateway. The gateway would be, the API gateway would be completely unaware of any filtration or masking happening if you leverage this type of technology. So Axiomatics data access filter is leveraging a proxy-based interception. It's a proxy that would sit in between the gateway and the data source and can filter and redact and mask any data access to that data store. There would be little to zero integration on the client side, and in this case, the API gateway. And the reason I'm saying little here instead of just no integration is that depending on the gateway, you might have to pass some end user context. You have to pass that along so that ADAF understands what user is trying to gain access. So from an architectural perspective, it would look something like this instead, that you have an application, for example, making an API call to the gateway. The gateway, if the gateway holds data in an ADAF supported data store, and this could be a relational database or a big data store like a Hadoop store that's exposing the data over a SQL layer, then their ADAF component with its SQL proxy can sit in between the API gateway and the data store and handle this masking and filtration automatically. The proxy would actually call an authorization engine. So here the flow is fairly similar to what we looked at before. It's just that it's happening at a different place in the flow. This would intercept the data that the gateway is calling. But this could also intercept the data from any other caller to the data store. It doesn't have to be the gateway. So it's a proxy that sits in front of the data store. And with that, we've moved into a demo where I'm going to use Apigee, and we're going to look at how this can happen and how this does happen in an Apigee gateway. But first, before I actually jump into the demo, I want to sort of set the stage for what we're using in the demo here. So we have an Apigee API gateway running that is exposing an API. It's got a backend API, which is just a REST API holding some sample JSON data. Excuse me. We as the authorization engine, we are using the cloud native PDP, also known as the Axiomatics Decision Service. It's running on Docker on an AWS instance. We leverage a REST and JSON attribute connector, or PIP, that holds the records or can get record information and user information. And I'm going to use Postman to send test requests to Apigee. Shortly on sort of the architecture for ADS that's running on Docker in Amazon, this is not entirely true because I actually don't have a load balancer. I just have one instance of the PDP, but it's running on Docker. And so what we've done, so it doesn't actually run on Kubernetes. It's not orchestrated that way. It's more simple than that. But the PEP here is the Apigee gateway. This the caller is going to be Postman, and the backend data here is the REST JSON service that I have that holds some sample record data. And then we have the PDP running inside of Docker on ADS that holds a policy, and we'll look at the sample policy next in memory, and it also has attribute connectors that are loaded there. From a graphical perspective, the policy looks like this. We're actually only really going to use part of this, but there's sort of a root node of the policy. We have a couple of different rules within that policy that says a manager can view any record, an employee can view a record in their own department. So that's an example of a relational or very fine-grained authorization use case. As soon as there's a relational aspect to it, it becomes a headache to handle with other authorization type of architectures like role-based access control, for example. This is probably the most important one for our use case that I'll show. And a client can view a record in their own department. And the description here is cut off a little bit. So we're going to see this in detail, what this entails. If we take the same policy, but look at it in our ALFA representation, ALFA is it's a domain-specific pseudo language to express XACML policies. It's something that Axiomatics came up with, and we handed over to the OASIS Technical Committee for Standardization a while back. So this is you can see here the R2.1 scenario represented in ALFA, and here's the full-blown description of it. A client can view a record in their own department with obligation to mask owner and status. What we're saying here is that if the user's role is client and the action is view or the action is get, it's essentially the same thing, right? One is more targeted towards an API use case here. And the record department is equal to the user department. Then if there's a permit decision there, we're going to return an obligation that returns the mask fields with the value owner and the value status. If we look at the user data, we'll probably have to jump back to this. I'm not going to cover this in full-on detail here, but these are some of the users we're going to use in the demo. Dan and Alice, more specifically, maybe Tim. They belong to different departments. They have different roles. We have several sample data records, but 123 and 131 are the ones that we'll probably mainly use here. Each record belongs to a different department, and they have different owners, etc. So if we jump into what that can look like, I have Apigee running right here. And just for sort of purposes of seeing that it actually goes through the gateway here, I'm going to start a trace session on on the Apigee gateway, so we can see what goes through the gateway when we send requests. And then in Postman here, I have a set of predefined requests that go straight to the gateways. You can see here that we're calling the gateway, and we are asking for access here to, we're performing get access to record 131 with the user Dan. And this is obviously just for demo and illustration purposes. You might be passing in some kind of user token in a header or something like that to determine who the user is. And that's all fine, and you can handle that in the gateway. It doesn't matter. What I do in the gateway is just I look for this parameter that's passed in, and that's going to be my user, right? And if I send this request here, we do get a record back. We get record 131 back. It looks like the owner and the status field are in fact redacted. And if we look now in the Apigee gateway, we don't have any data in here. Let's see if that had timed out. Oh, let's try to send that request again. Here we go. So what we can see here in the flow, we can see that a couple of things happen on the Apigee side. Here is one, for example, that's worth noting is we make a call out to the Axiomatics PDP here. And then we have a JavaScript here that's parsing the response. So this is the step where we're actually looking for the response from the authorization engine, and where we would parse out the obligation to understand, are we going to redact any fields, and if so, what fields are we going to redact? Down here, this is where we modify the backend API response. So we're calling the backend API, and we can see here in this step right here that we got a response from the backend API, right? It's right here. We can see that we got record 131, and we can in fact see the owner is Dan and the status of it is draft. But then in this here step, in this JavaScript step here, is where we modify that. And this is where we apply the obligation, the redaction that we got from the obligation, what fields to redact. And if we look at the step after here, we can see now that the payload has actually changed. It's formatted a little bit different here, but you can see in this payload that we actually return, the owner is just redacted to nothing, and the status is also redacted to nothing. And what happened here is that record 131, and it was the user Dan. If we go back to looking at this, Dan is in fact a client. And remember, the policy said that the clients can view records in their own department, but we are going to redact the owner and the status field. And 131 that we tried to get access to is in fact in the finance department. So that was absolutely correct. We can try some other requests in here too. We have Dan trying to get access to record 123. And in this case, we actually get not entitled to see data. And there's a perfectly fine explanation for that, is that record 123 belongs to the sales department. And remember, Dan, as a client, can only view records in his own department, and he's in the finance department. So he gets completely denied access to this record. Alice, on the other hand, is an employee, and employees can view records in their own location, and there's also no there's no obligation there. There's actually the policy doesn't say that any of the fields have to be redacted. So she gets access to record 123 fully, and she can see all of the fields in it. We can just try Tim. It's going to be the same result here as for Dan. Tim is actually of a type of user. He doesn't have a role that gives him access to any data. So it doesn't matter what kind of record we're trying to achieve here. or trying to access here, he won't get access to any of it. We can still see here that we have the request that we made is traced here in Apigee, and we can see that for Dan trying to access record 123, where we got access denied, essentially, we actually return a 403 back to the caller. So that's all handled within the gateway in itself. If I quickly show you the configuration of Apigee here, is we can see that we have some of these JavaScripts here where we, the first one here being, this is where we parse the response from the authorization engine and where we extract what fields to redact. We store that in a variable. And then later, when we modify the response, the payload, we go through and we iterate over all the fields in the payload, and then match it against what fields that we should redact. And if that's the case, we redact the field to just an empty string. But this is where you could put in a function then to do something more advanced than just writing an empty string back to it. And so with that, the demo is done, and we have a little bit of time here to look at some questions. So before I do that, let's summarize what we looked at here. We have discussed how to enable fine-grained authorization for APIs, and more specifically, how to mask and redact data. And what we used today was the Apigee gateway, and coupled with a JavaScript, a simple JavaScript that can handle the redaction. Obviously, we talked a little bit in the beginning about the power of ABAC in the sense that it's externalized, centralized, dynamic, and policy-based. And all of this could apply to other enforcement points. I mean, today we're talking about the API gateway, but the fact that it's externalized, centralized, dynamic, and policy-based would apply to any type of application, right? You can extract the authorization logic from the application with faster time to market and more flexibility in how applications are maintained. So if you are looking at adding fine-grained authorization for your APIs, you can hit up our website. You'll get a chat window where you can request a specific demo. You can also send an email to webinfo@axiomatics.com if you have any questions specifically or would like to discuss your API authorization use case further. We work with Apigee, but we also work with other leading API gateways like I showed in the beginning. So we have integration guides with several of them, and performing this type of redaction within the gateway would be very much possible with other gateways as well. It might have to be a little bit of different custom code made in order to make it happen. But there are several gateways out in the market that we support pretty much out of the box from an integration perspective. So with that, let's look at some questions that has come in here throughout the webinar. One of the questions is that is around the JavaScript that is mentioned in here for redacting. Can that be shared? That can absolutely be shared. Contact your Axiomatics representative. I was about to say you can contact me, jonas.iggbom@axiomatics.com, or that previously mentioned email there, or the chat on the website. If you're interested in that, we can absolutely share that. There's nothing proprietary about that at all. Does the Tyke, T-Y-K, Tyke API gateway support this type of parsing redaction? That is a great question. It's one of the gateways that's on my radar to look into. I actually have never looked at the Tyke API gateway. I know we've had some prospects that have been interested in it and did some work on their own. I would be very, very surprised if it was not possible, although I don't know exactly how to do it with Tyke just yet. It's one of those gateways that we haven't gotten to yet, but I'm sure it would be possible, and I'd be happy to, work together with whoever knows Tyke to kind of get an integration guide written and figure out how to do this. I know the principal steps of how to do it with all of the gateways we've previously integrated with. So if someone out there is an expert on Tyke, I'd be happy to work jointly to figure that out. One other question was around sort of ALFA and XACML. How does ALFA and XACML fit together? So ALFA is the ALFA syntax of the policy is not what the authorization engine uses. ALFA gets converted into XACML 3.0. So there's ways to compile the ALFA source into XACML. And that can either be done through a plugin for Eclipse or through a standalone compiler that converts the ALFA code into XACML. And then the XACML is what actually gets deployed to the authorization engine. And in my case, that was the cloud native PDP that we released earlier this year, late last year, I think. That was actually another question. Can the cloud native PDP only be deployed on Docker? And although I have it running in a Docker container in my demo environment here, no, it doesn't have to be deployed in Docker specifically. It's simply a jar that gets executed. So it fits really well in being containerized, but it doesn't have to be. It's extremely small in size and very, very fast to start up. You essentially provide it with a configuration that comes from our management system that has all the details about the policy and attribute connectors or pips that it needs to run, and it loads all of that into memory and exposes an authorization endpoint. Next question here was, is one decision from the PDP correlated to one obligation? And that is, that's a good question. There are ways to nest obligations. XACML policy is essentially a tree structure with nodes on the way to the end, and at the end there's a rule that gives a decision. At each node on the way to the rule, there could be an obligation. So you can actually, for one decision, for one permit decision, you could get multiple obligations or advice. Anything I say about obligations applies to advice as well. So you can actually get multiple obligations or advice back for one decision. Can the PDP or the authorization engine get information from the backend API in order to make an authorization decision? Yes, absolutely. It would essentially be a matter of configuring the authorization engine to have the backend API as an attribute connector. So if you look at this architecture here, for example, the PEP here is the API gateway. This box is the backend API. Now the PDP can have an attribute connector to the backend API. So if it's getting a request in for record 123, for example, it can then have an attribute connector to the backend API to get metadata, additional information about record 123 here before it makes a decision. So the authorization engine has a direct connection to the backend API in order to get metadata for the specific record, for example, that's being requested. And we had some more questions, but we're actually coming up right on the top of the hour here. So we will gather those remaining questions and respond directly to whoever asked those questions after the webinar here. And with that concludes our webinar here today. That was specifically around authorization of APIs and redacting and masking information, but Axiomatics performs or does access control for any number of different types of use cases and scenarios, and for different types of applications, off-the-shelf, homegrown applications, databases, big data solutions. So if you have any other authorization needs, please feel free to reach out to us through the communication channels that I mentioned earlier, the website and the chat, or webinfo@axiomatics.com. And I hope this webinar was useful and provided some good information for your API use case scenarios. Thanks, and have a good rest of the day.